Good day, everyone, and welcome to Orange Tree's webinar, The Marijuana Issue, What Every Employer Must Know. We are delighted to have you with us today and look forward to an exciting conversation with Bill Current. Bill is the president and founding partner of Current Consulting Group and a 30-year veteran of this industry. So there's a lot of knowledge that Bill brings to today's discussion. And our only regret is that we don't have more time. Before we start today's presentation, just a brief message from Orange Tree. I want to let you know that we do have a drug test integration. It's been in place now for the better part of 2019. It's been really successful for us. And in fact, Susan Cronin, who may be on today's call with Craig Therapeutics, may be joining us in just a few minutes. Early in the year, was one of our first implementers of the technology and had this to say about the technology and the integration, the impact it had on her and her team. And that is, before Orange Tree, it took 30 minutes on each candidate. The average result time was a week, and she had to spend time tracking the process. Now it takes less than a minute per candidate. The results are back in a few days, and Orange Tree does all the work. So there's no comparison to the efficiencies gained by moving to Orange Tree. Many of our clients have already moved to our integration. They're experiencing the same benefits that Susan is, which fundamentally is one of our mantras here at Orange Tree, is that we do our job so you can do yours. And we want to just take this moment today as a reminder to let you know that if you have not yet had the opportunity to move to the drug test integration, all of our clients will be moved effective Monday, December 2nd. There's some information in the handout that is available for everybody. It's already uploaded. You see that on the tool. If you have any questions on how to access that, please let me know. So there's some information there as well as a contact. Reach out to your client success partner if you have any questions regarding the integration, or Dave Peterson, who is our Director of Client Success. So that is a brief announcement today regarding our technology and its applicability to today's subject. To complete the introduction of Bill Current, as I mentioned, he's president and founding partner of Current Consulting Group and a 30-year veteran of the drug testing industry. Bill is the author of 10 books on substance abuse related issues and a regular presenter at conferences, seminars, workshops, and webinars. Bill is widely considered one of the leading experts on drug testing and the drug testing industry. Bill, we're delighted to have you. Thank you for being available to speak with us today, and I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody who's on today's webinar. First, I want to just commend Orange Tree for their webinar series this year. We've had the opportunity to work with them on a number of webinars over the years, and it's just so vital to provide this kind of information to clients. And this is such an effective way to do it, so we can all get back to work in about 60 minutes and stay productive, but with a lot more good, solid information. So I just wanted to send a shout out to Orange Tree for doing that. Let me just launch into this because I do have a lot of slides today. I'm going to try to get through most of them. Some of them will kind of we'll go through a little bit quicker than others. I know that this is a very, very timely issue. There's a lot going on in the United States and around the world, really, when it comes to marijuana, the legalization of marijuana, hemp, and cannabidiol or CBD oils, etc. How it affects the workplace, laws that are impacting what employers can and cannot do, restrictions that are being placed on employers in certain states, and what impact does that have on other states. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the new Nevada law, the new Illinois law, things like that, which are very pertinent because even if you're not in those states or you don't have business operations in those states, those are the things, what's happening in Illinois and Nevada, for example, New York City, another example, are things that you have to look out for in other places. And I'm not taking a position one way or the other from a political standpoint, just from the perspective of the employment situation in terms of employing people, hiring people, continuing to employ people, and then the impact that the legal use of marijuana could have on the workplace. So we'll go through all of those issues. And just from the very outset, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function that you have there in front of you. If we don't get to a question that you have during the presentation, ask it anyway. I mean, we're here to help you. We want to provide whatever information you have. When I go through the state laws, there's just not going to be enough time to cover them all. But if you have a specific question, I'll definitely address it. There were over 470 state bills, legislation introduced in 2019. Many of them, not hundreds of them, but many of them were passed and enacted, and most of them had to do with marijuana. And all of those marijuana laws had an impact on the workplace. So I won't be able to cover all of those, for example. There's over 100 still pending bills out there, but I've got the information on all of them. Jessica Polk from our staff have worked a long time to put all of this together in my notes. And so I've got tons and tons of that kind of information available. Happy to answer any questions that you have along those lines. So let's launch into it. First, I'm going to do a little overview of the marijuana situation, and I'm going to set the premise for that by suggesting that we ask the right question. And are we asking the right questions? Because it's not really a matter of whether or not you support legalization or you do not support legalization, but from an employment standpoint, are employees under the influence of marijuana less safe than other workers or not? Is it legal to drug test for marijuana in your state, and under what circumstances? Is it legal to take adverse employment action? Can you refuse to hire somebody in a pre-employment test who tests positive for marijuana if you're in a state where marijuana is legal? Can you fire somebody who violates your drug-free workplace policy by testing positive for marijuana, even if you're in a state where marijuana has become legalized? And it really sort of, I think, inspires the question of why is there such a rush to legalization? And we'll talk about that a little bit. A few statistics, though, to get us started. And we were talking earlier about a book I wrote a long, long time ago, or well, actually not that long ago, but it's called Why Drug Testing. I'm not promoting it because it's not available on Amazon or anything, but I went through and I just gathered in one place all the studies and statistics and reports that were out there so that there would be a proper citation for them. So I love statistics. And so we'll start with a few stats. These are all statistics that you see cited at the bottom of the screen. From 2014 to 2018, positive marijuana tests increased 16% nationwide. But in the states of Colorado and Washington, the first two states to legalize marijuana for so-called recreational use, marijuana positives, these are all workplace tests, increased 20% in Colorado and 23% in Washington. Those are humongous jumps in positive rates. And the reason I emphasize that so much is that one of the key arguments that the proponents of legalization made leading up to those votes in Colorado and Washington is that legalizing marijuana for recreational purposes was not going to result in more usage of marijuana. I don't know why people made that argument or believe that argument, but just the opposite has been true. There's been an increase in marijuana usage throughout the country. We see that in the National Survey on Drug Use and Health from the federal government, as well as in positive drug test results that are occurring in states that have legalized marijuana for recreational use. Nearly 80% of employers indicate that they are concerned. Excuse me, I've got a little cold that I'm fighting, and I think I'll just maybe have a lozenge in my mouth as I'm talking. That'll help. But nearly 80% of employers are concerned about an increase to workplace costs due to marijuana legalization. You see in the final bullet there that, you know, there's lots of different outward manifestations of somebody who's under the influence of marijuana. But the bottom line is it comes down to job performance. And one of the key areas that's of most concern to people is users of marijuana being under the influence while driving. And that could be for professional purposes, driving a truck, a delivery car, anything of that nature. But it also could be just out on the road. So 14.8 million Americans report driving within 1 hour of using marijuana in the past 30 days. The impairment potential of THC in the human body is highest when in that first 3 hours, 3 to 4 hours. So somebody who's using marijuana and driving within an hour of using marijuana is most likely under its influence, if not impaired one way or the other. 70% of respondents in a survey that was conducted by AAA, the AAA Foundation, the American Automobile Association, 70% considered driving shortly after, within an hour, of using marijuana to be very or extremely dangerous. That's good news, right? Well, would you believe that 95% in the same survey indicated that drinking and driving to be very or extremely dangerous? In other words, why are we thinking that somehow marijuana is less dangerous for drivers who have just used marijuana? 87% of this in the same survey said that they thought it was dangerous, excuse me, to use prescription drugs and drive a vehicle. So there's a lot going on there that we need to be aware of in terms of our attitudes about marijuana. Oops. The slides are not advancing. Let's see. Okay, there we go. There's a direct cost to the workplace of employees under the influence of substances like marijuana. The studies cited down below do not necessarily distinguish between marijuana and other drugs, but with marijuana being the drug that causes the most positives, or the drug that's most often abused, the majority of these percentages apply to marijuana users. So 35% of substance abusers are responsible for all absenteeism in the workplace. And substance abusers are 2.5 times more likely to be absent from work 8 days or more a year compared to non-substance abusing coworkers. Third, less productive, and they cost employers thousands of dollars a year. Now, one of the things that we've learned from Colorado and Washington is the direct impact on traffic fatalities related to marijuana. And there's a number of studies out on this. I don't have the statistics on this particular slide, but there has been a significant increase in traffic fatalities related to marijuana use since those two states legalized marijuana, where the driver of the vehicle tested positive for marijuana in an accident that caused a fatality. So translate that to the workplace and think about the impact that it could have on your company. So let me kind of jump ahead a little bit because this is in the later slide, but let me mention it now. So let's say that you're in a state that has legalized marijuana. You're an employer and you're kind of perplexed about what your rights are. Can we test for marijuana? Can we take action against someone who tests positive? Well, that employee who uses marijuana legally but is at work under the influence of marijuana, even if they didn't use marijuana well at work, but they smoked a joint or two before they started their shift. They come into the workplace. They're under its influence, that's for sure. Are they impaired? Well, legally, a drug test doesn't prove impairment. We know that. But are they impaired? Most likely. Let's say that individual then gets in a car and drives to another location in the scope of work. But he's under the influence of marijuana. What happens then if he causes an accident? Is the employer responsible for that behavior? He was using a legal substance. There is an area of law called respondeat superior, I know many of you are probably familiar with it, that says that an employer is responsible for the acts or actions of an employee when representing the employer. So if this individual's under the influence of marijuana, out doing something on behalf of the company and causes an accident and harms another person, most likely that's going to come back on the employer. And there's a tragic example of that here in Florida where I work and live, of a small air conditioning company, air conditioning repair company, not tiny, but a small one, small business, that entertained some clients after a conference in Fort Lauderdale, paid for all the drinks that everybody drank that night. The salesperson who was buying all the drinks for everybody also drank. And then because he wasn't staying at the hotel because he lived nearby, he drove home but was under the influence of alcohol. And he ran a red light and tragically ran into another car and killed 3 people. the individual, the survivors of the deceased, first tried to sue the hotel, but there are laws that protect serving establishments. Then they tried to sue the individual who caused the accident, but there was no money there. So they finally sued the air conditioning company. And so, and of course, they won, and that put the air conditioning company out of business. My point is, marijuana is also in many instances a legal substance, and one that we need to be cognizant of in terms of our responsibilities as employers. And I'm a small business owner myself, and what impact might come upon my company if my employees are out there representing my company while under the influence of marijuana, even if they used it legally in any one of these states. Now, as you look at this map, the states that are in orange are states that have passed recreational marijuana laws. The states in blue, medical marijuana laws. But keep in mind that all of the orange states also are medical marijuana states as well. So there's about 34 states total that have legalized marijuana, either for medicinal or recreational or both. And so, over half the country. And as I mentioned, there were 470 bills introduced throughout the country at the state level, many of which dealt with marijuana issues, some of which would legalize marijuana in states that you wouldn't imagine in the past would have legalized marijuana, like Texas, for example. Most likely to become legal in Texas as well. The point is that we're all affected by it, whether we're innocently driving down the road or whether we're looking at the situation from the lens of an employer. These are the states that have pending marijuana legislation just from this year. You can see Texas is there. But look as I go backwards, look at New Mexico, already has a medical marijuana law. And now I'm telling you that there's pending legislation in New Mexico on marijuana. Why? Because they're looking to legalize it for recreational use. In some states like California, which if I go back, will show you it's a recreational marijuana law and a medical marijuana law state. What are they looking to do? They're looking to broaden the rights of marijuana users in those states. In some cases, they're expanding the list of acceptable medical conditions that could justify a medical marijuana card. In other cases, like as you see over there, if I go backwards again, you'll see Illinois is a recreational marijuana law state, but they've passed a law that limits employers' rights to drug tests, pre-employment drug tests for THC, not for other drugs, but just for THC. And so we're seeing all types of legislation. And as the year comes to an end, a lot of it is still pending, meaning, some states have 2-year legislative seasons and some of this will carry over. Others will pass these laws before the year is over. So the story for 2019 is not complete yet, and some of it's going to spill over into 2020. So I mentioned before that it would be impossible to cover all of the state law and legislation issues in this presentation, but let me highlight just a few. Florida, for example. Florida originally passed a law that legalized medical marijuana, but you couldn't smoke marijuana. Now, SB 182 would make smoking medical marijuana legal. Let me just pause for one second. Okay, just want to get another cough lozenge out. Maine is an interesting state to begin with when it comes to drug testing in the workplace. But Maine's HB 942 would extend unemployment benefits to legal users of marijuana. So if somebody, for example, lost their job legitimately because they were smoking marijuana and they violated a company policy, traditionally that individual wouldn't qualify for unemployment benefits. In Maine, HB 942 would extend unemployment benefits to that marijuana user who lost his job legitimately, and that cost, of course, gets passed on to the employer. New Mexico, SB 406, employers cannot take action based on a positive drug test for marijuana. This is a typical bill that we're seeing now across the country in states that have legalized marijuana for one reason or another, where employers' rights to either test for THC or to deny employment to an applicant who tests positive for THC, or to take any kind of employment action against an individual for testing positive as an employee for testing positive for THC. We're seeing that in New Mexico, SB 406, but we've seen it in Illinois, we've seen it in Nevada, we've seen it in New York City. And it's something to be aware of because this is sort of the next wave of pro-marijuana legislation in our country. Oklahoma, HB 2612, and some of you may be from these states and be just as familiar or more so than I am. Oklahoma this HB 2612 would provide employment protections for medical marijuana users. So there is a carve out in many of these states, including the three I mentioned, Illinois, Nevada, and the city of New York, where there's a safety sensitive carve out, meaning that certain safety sensitive occupations are excluded from the restrictions on testing for THC. For example, in New York City, police officers, firefighters, and other types of first responder occupations are excluded from the restrictions on testing for THC. So, and we see that a lot throughout the country. That's a typical carve out that you'll see in general throughout the country as these bills are introduced. So I've kind of touched on the basics of this slide here, so we don't need to spend a lot of time on it. If you go down to the third slide, hemp legalization production, I'm going to talk about the 2018 Farm Bill in a little bit more detail in a minute. Well, it's coming up right now. So you're hearing a lot about this. You're wondering, how does this affect me as an employer? How does it affect my employees? I'm going to explain the difference between marijuana, hemp, and CBD now, because they do impact the workplace. So marijuana this is a term from the cannabis sativa plant. But it's typically a plant that contains more than 0.3% THC. Now, THC is tetrahydrocannabinol. It's the psychoactive ingredient found in marijuana. In other words, it's the thing that gives the user the feeling of being high, the euphoric feeling that people describe from using marijuana. It can contain large amounts of THC. I have a slide coming up, but I'll just tell you now that in some states like Colorado, for example, legal THC. Now keep in mind, there's really no limits. There's no oversight on the production of marijuana. There are laws, but there's really no oversight. There's no budget for these states to monitor marijuana production. And so there's THC available in places like Colorado with over 30% THC content in the marijuana that's being sold legally. That's a lot of THC. That can have a tremendous impact on the user. Typically, it's going to be more than 0.3% in order to qualify as marijuana versus another type of offshoot of cannabis. Hemp is another type of product that comes from cannabis, but it contains less than 0.3% THC. So it's not going to get the individual high, for example, because there's just not enough THC in it. Hemp has typically been used for, as you see the list there, it's been used in paper products, clothing, textiles, etc., because it's not the same thing as marijuana, and it doesn't have the THC content. The Congress, U.S. Congress, passed a law in 2018 that legalized hemp in the United States, but it restricted hemp to 0.3% or less of THC. So it's going to have THC in it, but it's just not going to have very much in it. The problem with that, though, is there's no oversight on that as well. And so there could be hemp out there that has a lot of THC in it. The thing you want to be concerned about is CBD, cannabidiol. Now, the two, sort of marquee components of marijuana, the two that get the most attention are THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and cannabidiol. Cannabidiol is the component in marijuana that people believe has a medical benefit. CBD is available in various forms, but you often hear the term CBD oil, or as you see there, CBD edibles that have CBD in them. If you go back long enough in time, like I do, you remember those Cheech and Chong movies from the 70s where people were eating brownies with marijuana in them. They were eating brownies with marijuana, with THC in it. But there are edible products being produced today that have CBD in them. CBD oils are available at your local, Bed Bath & Beyond. But again, there's very little oversight on the production of these products and their CBD content. And I've covered this as well, but this will kind of take you through. This is a very important slide to come away from, or to keep in mind as you come away from this presentation, because it breaks it down, the difference between hemp and marijuana. But let me come back to CBD, because the big issue right now is, will I test positive for marijuana if I'm not using marijuana, but I am using a CBD product that comes from, say, Bed Bath & Beyond? And the answer to the question is, laboratories do not test for CBD. So if somebody's using CBD, won't test positive because they've been using CBD, but they may test positive because CBD has THC in it. And so if they're using enough CBD, they're using it frequently, consistently over a period of time, it's not that they're going to test positive for CBD. They're going to test positive for THC, which is in the CBD. It's not supposed to be a high concentration, but it can be in the fatty tissues of the body if the individual is using CBD on a regular, almost daily basis. Then it's possible. The laboratory is not going to be able to distinguish between THC that came from smoking marijuana and THC that came from, sort of a compulsive daily use of a CBD product. The laboratory doesn't make that differentiation. So to your employees and to others that may be subject to drug testing, it's buyer beware, because these CBD products are not being over or supervised in any kind of way that would guarantee the user of any warnings that are on these products. My wife went into a store the other day. I think it was one of these health stores, where they sell different kinds of vitamins and supplements and things like that. And she asked the individual about the CBD products. And the guy was just like, really enthusiastic about the benefits of CBD oils and stuff. And it was kind of like he just had this, these talking points memorized, the marketing material. And he kind of went through his whole list, and she could tell he exhausted all of his talking points. And then she said, what do you think? What do you really think? He said, I would never use these products. There's no way to know what's in it. And that's from somebody who sells CBD oils for a living at a health store. So you have to be careful. Your employees have to be careful, because the drug test is not going to distinguish between the source of the THC being a marijuana joint or some type of CBD product. Okay, so I hope you're writing down your questions. Let's talk about accommodations, okay? So there are a lot of people out there, and Current Consulting Group does a survey every year of the drug testing industry, and then of the employees, the end users, the buyers of drug testing services of our clients. And so there's a lot of confusion right now among employers and sometimes drug testing providers, not Orange Tree, for example, but that there's this misunderstanding that it's illegal to drug test, or it's illegal to test for marijuana, or you cannot do anything when somebody tests positive for marijuana. So thinking about these various legal marijuana laws that are popping up all over the country, it's a growing trend, excuse me, and it's going to continue for a while. What does it mean? A positive marijuana test on its own cannot be the sole basis for workplace discipline in most states now. Supervisors should know how to identify signs of impairment. We've said this all along in the drug testing industry, that a positive drug test on, say, a reasonable suspicion test is just one element to support whatever type of adverse employment action your company handbook or policy would require. An individual who's late to work all the time, an individual whose work performance is suffering or is subpar. Your supervisors are trained to be able to identify the signs of impairment, regardless of the reason for the impairment, and then to create a paper trail to document that impairment, so that you're not relying solely on a drug test result to make the determination to terminate someone's employment or to have them, be put on warning or anything like that. This is particularly important nowadays when it comes to marijuana positive drug test results. That can't be the sole reason why you're implementing some type of discipline with that individual. These laws do not mean that employers cannot test for marijuana. They do not mean that you should not test for marijuana. And in many places in the country, you can take adverse employment action based on your written policy that's been communicated to your employees and is being implemented and maintained by your supervisors. But you have to be careful that you're not taking action based solely, in many states, solely on the result of a drug test for THC. Now, you may be thinking, what about DOT drug testing regulations? That is a completely different ballgame. Now we're talking about federal law versus state law. And generally speaking, federal law always trumps state law. DOT regulations have specific disciplinary actions, not necessarily termination of employment, that must occur in the event of a positive drug test result or any one of the drugs that are in the drug test panel, including THC. So some of these restrictions that exist in some states do not apply to the DOT regulations. They may not even apply to certain other types of safety sensitive occupations in those states, depending on how the various state law is written. But when I say that these things apply or don't apply, it may not necessarily be the same with DOT. In fact, the DOT regulations are very clear. Employers that are covered by the DOT regulations must continue to test for THC and must remove individuals from performing covered safety sensitive duties and responsibilities if they test positive for THC. Now, there are a lot of states right now, as I mentioned earlier, that are starting to pass laws that specifically limit or restrict or eliminate an employer's right to deny employment based on a THC positive or to terminate employment based on a THC positive. And if you do, in some places like Maine, as we talked about earlier, there may be an extension of unemployment benefits that you as the employer are going to be responsible for. And these are just some of the states. You see Illinois on there right now, but others in Nevada and others joining the list as well. Some of these accommodations are included under discrimination laws, and some of them are included under the marijuana laws, or in most cases, both. So you have to, the general rule of thumb when it comes to state drug testing laws is read the fine print and review them often. Now, this is not a pitch for using Orange Tree's policy services, although you may want to consider doing this, which is if you haven't reviewed and updated your drug testing policy in more than a year for sure, and you're in multiple states, then you definitely need to do that because laws are being passed all the time that could impact the legitimacy of your drug testing policy, especially if you're in states that have legalized marijuana and in other states, like you see the list here, that have passed workplace discrimination and accommodation laws as well for marijuana. So let me get to Nevada, for example. This goes into effect January 1st, 2020. Employers cannot fail, meaning cannot consider somebody who tests positive on a pre-employment test to have failed the test, or refuse to hire prospective employees because of marijuana metabolites in a drug test. This includes, there are safety-sensitive carve-outs in the Nevada law, just like I talked about for New York City, and you see that off to the right. It does not preempt federally mandated drug testing. You see that on both sides of the slide here. DOT regulations still trump these state drug testing laws. Now, go back up here, and I put in orange because of marijuana metabolites. I just want to point out that many state drug testing laws are written on the basis of how urine drug testing is conducted, whether it's lab or instant result testing. Nowadays, with I should have maybe mentioned this earlier, but I'm sure most or many of you are aware that the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, recently released on October 24th and 25th in the Federal Register the final guidelines or mandatory guidelines for allowing lab-based oral fluid drug testing in federal drug testing programs, meaning federal workplaces with federal employees. DOT has already stated that their objective now is to have DOT regulations in place by the end of the 12 to 18-month implementation period for the SAMHSA federal workplace regulations, meaning that in the next year to year and a half, DOT will allow testing for oral fluid as part of complying with the DOT drug testing regulations. The reason I point that out is because with oral fluid, you're testing for the parent drug, you're testing for the drug itself, because the window of detection with oral fluids is usually within minutes after ingestion of a drug, right after usage, up to a period of hours. Whereas with urine, we're testing for a metabolite, a metabolic breakdown of that drug in the person's urine, in their system, in their body system. And so some of these laws are written as if it only will apply to urine drug testing. And you're going to think, well, I'm safe with oral fluid testing. It's only because they didn't know to put that in their laws, and you'll see some amendments to these laws in the future. I think, though, that because of marijuana's shorter window of detection, an employer can make the case probably with a little bit more, a little bit more validity that a marijuana positive, a THC positive in an oral fluid test may indicate recent usage because the window of detection is just a series of hours versus with urine or hair testing, where we're talking about days and maybe weeks as far as the window of detection goes. Illinois, we don't have to go into a great amount of detail here, but you can see that there's certain language in these laws, and Illinois is a great example of this, and this is the one that goes into effect January 1st, where employers are not required to permit employees use of marijuana while at the workplace, while performing job duties, or while on call. They can't bring marijuana into the workplace. They can't exchange it with other people, etc. All of those conditions remain to the favor of the employer. But there are certain things that the employer cannot do. And as we saw, they cannot not hire somebody because they tested positive, or they cannot fire somebody because they test positive. But go down to that last bullet on the slide. Employers must have a good faith belief that an employee is under the influence of marijuana, and that they can establish that good faith belief over and beyond the drug test result. I emphasize that because that term good faith belief is catching on around the country. As the pro-legalization movement influences legislation, you see that good faith belief. In other words, the burden is being placed on the employer to say, well, I have a good faith belief that this individual is under the influence or perhaps impaired. Well, we know from various, decades of case law history that a drug test doesn't prove impairment from a legal standpoint, but recent usage, maybe, depending on the type of test that you're doing. So you want to be looking at the language in your drug testing policy and defining what good faith belief means to your company. And steering away from the term impaired or impairment, because we can't really say that a drug test proves impairment. We don't want to use that term, even though you see it in a lot of these marijuana legalization laws that are passed around the country. The term impairment is used incorrectly, but you can define what under the influence means in your drug testing policy. And among other things, being under the influence may be defined in your company policy as somebody who tests positive, depending on lots of other factors, right? What type of test you're doing, under what circumstances, post-accident versus random, etc. But you want to define these terms so that if, as an employer, you have to take action based on a positive drug test result, you can do it in good faith in accordance with what you have in your policy. Let me skip past this. I thought I had a slide. I apologize. I thought I had a slide on New York. Let me go back up here to just for a second. And maybe none of you are in New York City, or maybe none of you have employees in New York City, but this is an important law. It's not a state law, it's a city ordinance, but it's going to prohibit testing for THC as a condition of employment. In other words, it's going to eliminate pre-employment testing for THC. You can test for cocaine and heroin, etc. But in New York City, and starting in May, according to this law, with certain safety-sensitive carve-outs, you're not going to be able to include THC in a pre-employment test. And that's an important thing to know, and Washington, D.C. looks like it's heading in that direction as well. But that's a good thing to know because these laws get passed in certain states, Illinois, Nevada, New York City as an example, and they become sort of the model for future legislation in other states. And so you want to know what it says. This is extremely restrictive in New York City, We're not seeing a lot of that throughout the country, but it's popping up more and more. And let me just skip past some of these because I can see the time is going quickly, and I want to allow ample time for questions and answers at the end. Let me address the issue of why you should continue testing for marijuana, even if you're in a state with a legal marijuana law. So let's compare it to alcohol, because that's the one that gets brought up all the time. You know, alcohol is legal, therefore marijuana should be legal because they have the same effect on a person who uses those substances. Well, that's not exactly true, but let's say that we're going to go with that argument. So if you have one drink, are you under the influence? Well, maybe, maybe not. Depends on the individual, right? There are a lot of factors that go into how alcohol impacts impairment. So you may have one glass of wine or one beer and not necessarily be impaired by using it, okay? Impairment occurs when, or is defined as when you can no longer function at whatever your normal level is. In the workplace, that could be a very serious condition to be in, right? Unable to do certain things like think clearly or act physically correctly. That last bullet there, a person who is actually impaired by alcohol can be convicted of impaired driving, whether or not the person's blood or well, we'll stay with blood here, was above the legal limit. You know, so 0.08 is the legal limit, and I have let me just scan down to a slide or some notes I have because I want to share with you something that goes along with this. One of the most famous cases of an individual excuse me, who didn't test positive for alcohol, but had other drugs in the system. And let me find out where this is here. It was, and you're all going to remember this, but this was the incident involving Tiger Woods. Tiger Woods, the famous golfer, was found asleep in his car on the side of the road. His car had been damaged. He was slumped over, just completely out of it. He tested completely negative for alcohol, but he had a host of other drugs in his system. If the only thing that the officers were testing for was alcohol, Tiger Woods would have been okay. But he was tested for other substances and tested positive for a number of painkillers, THC, and some other substances that all resulted in Tiger Woods being, quote unquote, under the influence, but definitely impaired at the time that the officers discovered him on the side of the road in his damaged vehicle, asleep at the wheel. Now, to his credit, he had pulled over and wasn't going anywhere, but he had gotten that far, and he had obviously been in some type of an accident. So the cutoff levels that we use for determining driving under the influence or a driver being impaired, and those that we use in the workplace have a significant meaning because we're testing. Well, let me pull away from the roadside test and say in the workplace we're testing for drugs at certain cutoff levels, and those cutoff levels have been determined by and large by the federal government, especially if we're doing lab-based testing in compliance with the DOT regulations. So an individual whose positive drug test is positive because of meeting those various nanogram per milliliter cutoff levels would be considered, at the very least by your company policy, under the influence. Although we're not going to make the case that the individual was impaired. Obviously, Tiger Woods was impaired at the time that the officers found him. But in the workplace, we're going to define under the influence and steer away from the term impairment because the drug test result is not going to necessarily, from a legal standpoint, prove that the individual was impaired. Now, going back to the roadside test, a DUI can be proven by cutoff level, by signs of impairment, by a breath or blood test. And I'm just suggesting that in the workplace, we want that drug test at a certain cutoff level, using the federal cutoff levels as our guide, but also backing it up maybe even preceding it with documented signs of impairment based on job performance or behavior in the workplace, okay? 20% of young workers, these are people under the age of 30, admit to using marijuana on the job. Are they under the influence or impaired at the time? We're not saying that right at this point. But marijuana potency, as I mentioned earlier, towards the beginning of this presentation, has dramatically increased over the past 30 years. Where the marijuana that's available today is has a much higher and more potent THC content than the marijuana that was used when I was in high school in the 1970s. So let's go back to our buddies at Cheech and Chong. You know, pick whatever Cheech and Chong movie you want to, right? But they were always talking about certain types of or certain brand names of marijuana, Acapulco Gold, for example, and what a high they got off of it and how strong and potent it was. Well, the average THC content in the 1970s was anywhere from 3 to 7%. Nowadays, we're looking at THC content of over 30%. So this is a much stronger drug today with a greater potential for impairing the user, and I'm using that word impairing, especially within the first 24 hours, than the drugs that were used in the 1970s, right? So the joke that we used to always use, and when I was at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and we were giving presentations on this in the late 80s and early 90s, was that, you know, you would have to lock yourself in a phone booth with Cheech and Chong for 24 hours, smoking marijuana the whole time to have the same impact, you know, nowadays that from the THC content of nowadays today's marijuana versus the marijuana that was used back in the 1970s. Marijuana tops the list. This is from one major laboratory where they were showing the increase in the positivity rate by industry. So look on this list, see if any of the industries that you're in are on this list. You can see that this is not the positivity rate by industry, it's the increase by industry. So you can see that transportation and warehousing and other services, which is sort of a catch-all that they have, but then construction, wholesale trade, manufacturing, etc. These are industries where there is more increase in marijuana usage and positive results than other industries. This is just a little sort of glimpse into where the problem seems to be the most serious right now. And you're going to have access to all of these slides so you can take a look at these things.
Hey, Bill, this is Jeff. Is there?
Hi, Jeff.
Looks like we have about a half dozen questions or so. We're right at about 10, 11 minutes out. Not at wanting to cut you off here. This is really terrific material. When might be a good time for us to take a question or two?
Yeah, let's do it.
Are you ready now? Okay, let's go back to the top here. We'll go through them in the order they're asked. First one, we are a manufacturer with a zero tolerance drug policy. What language needs to be in the drug testing policy specifically about medical marijuana?
That's a great question. It's one that comes up a lot. Let me answer it two different ways. One, of course, it's in your best interest as an employer to understand and ensure that you're complying with the language of the local medical marijuana law that applies to you. If you're just in that one state, or if you're in a number of different states, you may need several different amendments to your policy depending on how you're going to treat the topic of medical marijuana. But you want to make sure that you're in compliance with all applicable state laws pertaining to medical marijuana, pertaining to recreational marijuana, and any limitations or discrimination language that may be in any of these laws. That's number one. But number two, keep in mind that you as the employer are still responsible for the safety and the well-being of all of your workers. And so these laws are not intended to give additional rights to marijuana users that would place your other workers in jeopardy or in an unsafe environment. So from a policy standpoint, what you want to do is obviously reflect the state law, but also, and you'll find this in most of these legalized marijuana states, you want to have language in there that says, under no circumstances will an individual be allowed to be at work under the influence of marijuana, use marijuana while at work, bring marijuana to the workplace or exchange marijuana with others while on the job. And so the workplace could be defining your policy as wherever, job functions take place. Maybe it's in a warehouse or a manufacturing plant, but maybe it's also in the car or in a truck while they're making deliveries or representing the company away from the traditional work site. Here's the bottom line, though. You want to make sure that your policy contains as much language as possible so that if you're ever challenged legally, there's really nowhere for that lawyer to go because your policy covers all of these issues. It covers an explanation of what you consider to be under the influence, which is, among other things, a positive test result. And the fact that you articulated and then informed all of your employees that under no circumstances can they be under the influence of marijuana while on the job. That needs to be in your policy.
Great. We have a question from Amy in Minnesota. If someone is hurt at work, can the hospital test for any substances? And if so, is this grounds to fight the workers' comp claim?
Well, okay, so this is a little bit of a sticky issue in most states, and I'd have to review Minnesota just to be clear on the answer, but let me say this, that obviously when somebody is hurt on the job, it may, by policy, trigger a post-accident drug test, not only of the individual who was injured, but anybody else who may have been involved or related to the injury. The other person, somebody else may have caused the accident. But you want to make sure, and your policy must state this, that making sure the individual receives the medical attention they need is the priority. So you want to make sure that you've done that. But you're not actually going to be able to tell the hospital to conduct a drug test for you. It's not something that a hospital would automatically do in terms of meeting the requirements or the language of your drug testing policy. But they are gonna, excuse me, draw blood from that individual because they're gonna need to know what types of legal drugs they can give that individual that may or may not, interact with illegal drugs. And so some of that information may be discovered, but it wouldn't be necessarily in compliance with whatever your policy language is. And so my bottom line there is to be cautious, to be careful. Don't prolong, or excuse me, don't hesitate to make sure an individual gets the proper medical care that they need. And the drug test would be secondary to those concerns and meeting those needs.
Bill, my compliments, because you're tackling some tough questions, and obviously there's a lot of specificity dependent. Next one, as a manager, if you observe an employee as impaired, can you in good faith discipline or warn the employee?
Well, you definitely, again, you're not, as you've described it from that question, you're not necessarily reacting to a drug test result. So people can be impaired on the job for a lot of different reasons, right? Lack of sleep, or reaction to a legally used and obtained medication or prescription drug, or it could be, related to illegal drug use. So the way the question was worded is absolutely, because you're not basing anything on a drug test result, but a person who on the job is not performing according to, the job description. But here again, I would caution you to make sure that there's documentation of the impaired behavior. Whatever the reason for the impairment, that's almost secondary in a way. You want to make sure that you're documenting the performance or the behavior that is prompting this supervisor to believe that this individual is quote unquote impaired or unable to function properly on the job, so that when you do take action, if you choose to do so, you have a number of different reasons to justify it besides the potential drug test result that you may have down the road.
Okay. From Jody Ann, would you suggest an employer follow the same procedure after a positive result for THC, whether the employee says they use CBD or they use marijuana recreationally? That's
an excellent question, and it's one that's going to just come up more and more now that that CBD oil usage, for example, is becoming more and more common. Here's the problem, as I mentioned earlier. The drug test doesn't distinguish where the THC came from. It's not going to tell you that this is a THC positive for somebody that's been using CBD oils. So as an employer, you're just getting a positive result for THC. The drug test doesn't distinguish the source of the THC. So it places you in a very precarious situation as the employer, because you can't really distinguish. You can't really, I mean, it kind of seems almost like it could be possibly an excuse on the part of the individual. So you've got to be very careful. But here again, your policy is the key. What's written in your policy should always be your guide. So make sure that your policy is not trying to distinguish between CBD usage and, you know, marijuana usage, for example, but that it's just based on positive drug test results using established cutoff levels for THC in this case that are supported by the federal government and that are permitted by local law. I think you mentioned the individuals in Minnesota. So you are allowed to test in the workplace in Minnesota. There are some restrictions that apply there, but there's no law in Minnesota that says you cannot conduct drug testing. And again, make sure your policy states that we're unable to distinguish or to identify the source of the THC on a positive result. Therefore, in the interest of not discriminating against anybody, somebody who tests positive for THC will be subject to the following possible consequences.
Is there a legal restriction on an employer receiving the percentage levels of drugs found in a drug test? I'm trying to paraphrase a couple of sentences. Does that make sense?
Could you repeat it?
Request the specificity of the different drug levels in a test?
Oh, you mean from the laboratory?
Yeah, I think that's how it reads.
Well, so the laboratory, there are restrictions on what the laboratory can report to you, right? You know, they can't, even though in a urine sample, for example, it's possible to test for other things like pregnancy, for example. They're not going to report those things. They're not looking for those things. They're not going to necessarily know those things, nor will they report those kinds of things. And so it would be challenging on an individual basis to ask a laboratory to provide any information that's not normally provided. And I think that would probably be something, and I don't know because I've never been asked that question before, but I think it would be something very challenging for the laboratory to agree to do, but I could be wrong on that. But it would have to be handled on a sort of a lab by lab basis. But you know, treating one test differently than other tests or being quote unquote inconsistent in any way is usually an invitation for trouble.
Good point. Jodianne, we'll follow up with you on that too, because I know there was a kind of a part two in there. Next question for you, Bill. Federal contractors that need to comply with the Drug-Free Workplace Act. How do employers comply with state laws about not testing for THC or terminating for a positive test, yet still comply with federal requirements?
That is one of the best questions because there's so much confusion on that. And I've been doing this for 30 years and this confusion has existed all this time. So let me clarify. The Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act does not require drug testing. There's no drug testing component in the Drug-Free Workplace Act. There are other things that are required, like supervisor training and employee education and access to employee health EAP programs, employee assistance programs. But drug testing is not actually required under the Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act. You would think it would be, but it never has. It's different than DOT, it's different than the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, et cetera, both of which require drug testing. The Federal Drug-Free Workplace Act doesn't. So there's really no conflict in complying with the Drug-Free Workplace Act and then complying with any restrictions on drug testing that might apply in your state because the Drug-Free Workplace Act doesn't include drug testing.
Thank you, Michelle, for that question. Teresa has this question. If you are based and hire in one state, but perform contract work in another state, which state's laws apply for post-accident, random, and reasonable suspicion?
that is probably, I keep saying this because these are great questions, but that's one of the most common questions when it comes to addressing state law issues. So generally speaking, the state law that applies is where the workers work and live. So let's say you're in Minnesota and you hire, but you have business operations, even if it's just temporary, you're just doing a 1 or 2 year construction project in, say, Illinois. For those workers in Illinois who live and work in Illinois, the Illinois laws apply to those workers, not the laws of the state where the company is headquartered, but in the state where the individuals live and work. Now, if you have an individual from Minnesota who's traveling to Illinois on business, then that's different, right? He or she is just in and out. So it's still that, the home state, Minnesota, would apply to that individual. But if you say you hire 100 workers for a construction project that your company's doing in another state, the law of that other state would apply, even though your company is headquartered in Minnesota.
And it looks like the final question here from Alyssa. In states where medical marijuana has been legalized, how does an employer handle candidates who disclose they have a medical marijuana card in advance of administering a pre-employment drug test?
One word: carefully. I don't mean to be facetious, but you can't discriminate against that individual based on however you found out that they're a registered medical marijuana user. It would be disastrous. That individual, if for whatever reason they didn't get the job, they could come back and claim that it was because you knew that they were a medical marijuana user. So now I say that, but let me add this caveat that you have to look at the individual state law that applies, because the language is different from state to state. There's no one model that they all used and they all created their laws from that one model piece of legislation. So you do have to look at the different individual state laws that you're talking about. But generally speaking, and we see this more and more states either amending their medical marijuana laws or passing new medical marijuana laws that have this sort of quote unquote anti-discrimination language in it, where you can't discriminate against an individual because they're a registered medical marijuana user, regardless of how you found that out.
Carefully seems to be an operative word for today's webinar, Bill.
Yeah.
That concludes our questions. Bill, thank you very much. Well, you tackled those questions head on, didn't sidestep any, and I'm sure there'd be more information to explore in a dialogue with these particular employers who are trying to do their best to provide a safe workplace, hire consistently, give people the opportunities, and do everything the right way all day, every day. So tough topic for everybody. Thank you very much. I will just draw everyone's attention to the handout that is available. You can download it right now. There will also be an email that is sent out, if not by end of day today, first thing tomorrow. A link to the webinar, send it to your colleagues who maybe didn't have a chance to attend. I think they'll find this of great value. The handout also, I will just say, Bill, you set the stage. The handout includes notes, and the notes are very thorough. I sent out a group chat. Starting on slide 19, not to be confused with PDF page, something different than that, but slide 19, there's just a wealth of information on all of the different, or I would assume most of the different things that are happening at a state level. So a great document for not only the charts and the information, the data, but a lot of the context that Bill actually shared with us at a detailed level. So make sure you get your hands on that. Finally, any questions that we weren't able to answer, or maybe we prompted some additional ones, reach out to your client success partner here at Orange Tree, or you can contact myself, Jeff Ernst, J Ernst, which is JERNSTE at OTES.com, or you can call me, text me 952-406-9569 anytime. We'll get the information, whatever you want, as soon as we can in a very quick and easy fashion. So Bill, thank you very much again. Terrific presentation. Thank you everyone for your attendance today, and have a wonderful day.